Good afternoon, friends. I'm Homi Bhabha, and I direct the Mahindra Humanities Center. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this presidential panel this afternoon. Let me just quickly explain the format. After a brief introduction, our speakers will take the floor. We'll then have questions and answers. And we're very fortunate that at the end of the question period, President Faust will share some reflections with us. Wonderful to see you all here on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm delighted that your classes and seminars have been allowed a little time to enjoy the summer weather. Great to have you here. When President Faust asked the Mahindra Center to help convene this event, I propose that the title, The Humanities and the Fate of the University. She rightly suggested, quite quickly, that we should replace fate with future, a more hopeful and open-ended word. And this reminded me that when I became director of the Humanities Center, I vowed never to hold an event in which the word crisis appeared alongside the humanities in the title, and we have never had one like that. Not only is this such a well-worn topic that it pulls about 350,000 results in a recent Google search, but it puts the humanities in an unnecessarily defensive position, and it also obscures the rare forms of agency which the humanities bring to the life of the university. Rather than wring our hands, I thought it made more sense to organize activities that reach across and beyond the Harvard campus to show what the humanities are and what they can do. Yet, this is the backtrack moment, the crisis is real and it is global. According to the National Science Foundation, spending for the humanities research in 2011 amounted to less than half of 1% of the amount dedicated to science and engineering research and development in the US. In the UK, the total budget of the Arts and Humanities Research Council for a year is less than the cost of the failed and written-off National Health Service IT initiative. And now imagine this. A leading Indian Dalit, that's untouchable, intellectual, Sundar Sarukkai, and his colleague George Verghese recently undertook an outreach tour of colleges in the southern states of Karnataka and Kerala. Besieged by demoralized groups of students, this is their language, not mine, who had been subjected to social science and domestic taboos for choosing to follow a humanities curriculum, Sarukkai and Verghese were particularly struck by the testimony of a woman studying psychology at a government women's college in the South. In India, psychology is considered to be a humanities discipline. She said, "Being a Hindu, my parents, teachers, and friends would have pardoned me even if I had eloped with a Christian or Muslim boyfriend, but they couldn't forgive me for deserting the pure sciences and joining a humanities course," a real cri de coeur. Sarukkai and Verghese's response to the widespread, as they put it, insecurity, anguish, and hopelessness of those choosing the humanities is quite remarkable. They suggested that students should be directed to reading Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil in her essay on Eichmann in Jerusalem. This is Arendt in Karnataka, which I think is quite remarkable. They argue via Arendt that the humanistic disciplines foster the vital connection between language, thinking, and ethicality. It is by learning to read in the style of the humanities, at once empirically and critically, and by reflecting deeply on the act of interpretation, that individuals can resist, to whatever degree, the unethical imperative that, as Hannah Arendt put it, says, obey first and think later. An undue emphasis on data-driven inquiry risks overwhelming our tolerance for the incremental and iterative time it takes to make sense of the humanities. The humanities are not quantitative, nor are they simply qualitative. They are integrative. The back and forth of open-ended conversations, the ongoing revision of critical dialogues, remembering, repeating, and working through, interpretation, intervention, interlocution, the entangled practices of doubt and deliberation, of description and critique, the energy of aspiration. The humanities are, in this sense, projective and processual disciplines rooted in the character of university education as neither a beginning nor an end, but a middle. This phrase, rooted in the middle, that deftly locates both the time and temper of the humanities and the liberal arts, comes from Michael Oakeshott's provocative essay, The Idea of the University. The quality of aspiration that dwells deep in the humanities is not an indulgent form of free play for the benevolent imagination. Humanistic knowledge is profoundly grounded in social context and human discourse, language, dialogue, politics, narratives, symbols, images, and the value of aspiration is achieved through the institutionalization of good habits of interpretation. The humanistic commitment to interpretation encourages the exercise of independent free will, but the act of interpretation is a gesture of reaching out, of empathy towards the lives, works, and histories of others. Interpretation affirms the individual's right to free expression and belief, but it also makes it possible for laws, customs, political ideas, and traditions to be read against the grain so that those who are discriminated against or disempowered might be able to take up positions from which they may imagine the unjust world and their perilous present condition otherwise than it is. The humanities lead a double life. They're the guardians of humanistic culture, keeping alive immanent values and traditions that sustain human existence. At the same time, the humanities have an imminent impact on the world that they help to invent. Their aesthetic and ethical presence accompanies us in the choices and judgments we have to make. They provide flashes of insight that change the direction of time-worn habits of thought, and they urge us to rethink the past in the present and refashion the future. I'm enormously grateful to President Faust for suggesting this evening's event. I'm very grateful for Radcliffe's welcoming hand always. Thank you, Liz. Thank you very much. And I'm, of course, delighted and grateful to my panelists, Lawrence Bacow, Stefan Collini, Lynn Hunt, Sheldon Pollock, and Diana Sorensen, all very distinguished. All their distinguished achievements are in your program, so I won't repeat them. Welcome and thank you for being here and for agreeing to share your thoughts with us. As I said, after the period of question and answers and the discussion we'll have, President Faust will share her thoughts with us. Thank you for being here this afternoon.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. One convenience of having the session introduced by Homi is that it leaves me so little to say about the humanities. The humanities, as I think we all recognize, form a relatively small part of the activity of the modern research university, but a relatively large part of all discourses about the fate or future of the university. And this may be not simply because those who dilate on such matters are drawn disproportionately from humanities disciplines. It may be in part because the discourse about the humanities has become a locus and, in some senses, a placeholder for wider anxieties about the changing relations between culture and democracy, between education and economy. Now, these anxieties have real objects, as well as, like all anxieties, their exaggerated or phantasmatic aspects. And it's certainly true that if we are to talk intelligently about the forms of higher education in the 21st century, then we do need very seriously to develop a vocabulary and a perspective which will challenge the ritualistic invocation of economic growth as though that were a sufficient or indeed a wholly intelligible human end. Nonetheless, in these brief remarks, I don't want to encourage this only partly conscious use of the category of the humanities as a way of addressing these wider issues, not least because it tends to make so much of the discourse about the humanities simultaneously too defensive and too pious. Indeed, almost any event or discussion with the humanities in its title risks, as I think Homi himself was hinting earlier, being either predictable or depressing, or both. Predictable because after running through various travails and accusations, the humanities we know really, if such a session takes place, will emerge in their full redemptive glory before the session is over as the one indispensable way of living a fully adequate human life and so on. And as the grand adjectives pile up, obviously it becomes a little difficult to suppress a yawn. And depressing because despite the inevitable arrival of the cavalry of the deepest human values at the right moment, in one way or another, the story that is told up to that point tends to be one of beleaguered and defensive kind, which often oscillates between the self-justifying and the complaining. This occasion, of course, is not going to be like that. So all I'm going to do in these brief remarks is just take a rather quizzical look both at the activity of justifying and the category of the humanities itself in an attempt to scrub away some of these congealed abstractions. And I'll then quickly just suggest one or two ways of engaging in the public discourse about the humanities which are less defensive and more specific. Obviously, the greater part of my own direct experience, as you can at least hear from my accent, is going to be derived from Britain. But I think there are all kinds of things which, although the public culture of higher education in the United States is far, far more diverse, are shared, and indeed shared not just by Britain and the United States, but by many other contemporary societies. And anyway, hearing a little about how things are going in Britain may have the indirect effect of cheering you all up about your own fate. So let me begin with a very obvious point about justification. The activity of justifying something is highly context-dependent. It depends, first of all, on the kind of criticism or skepticism which is being responded to, or at least anticipated. And second, it always depends upon being able to establish some commonality of values, some bridgehead in even the most hostile critics' assumptions, if the attempt at justification is to gain any purchase at all. So for these reasons, it doesn't seem to me very helpful to try to develop some all-purpose justification couched in highly abstract terms. It may be better to think of particular forms of resistance we want to overcome or challenge on the part of particular publics. And this means that the form and argumentative strategy of our exercises in persuasion have, I think, to be tailored accordingly. The relevant publics may, as we all know, be very diverse. Legislators, parents, foundation administrators, journalists, school children, colleagues, donors, government officials, students, taxpayers, and so on. And of course, any actual individual may belong to more than one of those categories. Now, quite a lot of the well-meaning statements that are issued about the humanities tend to reduce to a series of abstract nouns in which imagination, knowledge, and all the other usual suspects invariably figure. Now, justification at this level of abstraction can occasionally be useful, especially if it's preceded by some more detailed or concrete characterizations. But one obvious weakness of this strategy is that it's fatally easy for any interlocutors to enthusiastically endorse these large-sounding claims while not actually being persuaded about or conceding anything to the more local or institutional or financial case that these claims are meant to support. Another, perhaps slightly less obvious weakness is that such high-flown claims don't seem to entail the array of often knotty, detailed, and quite often empirical inquiries that make up the actual practices of our various disciplines. Many of these elevated claims for the humanities end up sounding as though their goals could be met if everyone would just read the Odyssey and King Lear with an open heart. This is one of the places where the logic of justification, it seems to me, can lead us astray. There's a tendency for defenders of universities to want to present them as contributing to every approved social good, including the promotion of equality of respect, social mobility, and general niceness. This seems to me a mistake, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of tactics. Universities, I'm sorry to have to say, are not collective forms of relationship counseling or extended versions of the kind of weekend in which paintballing and whitewater rafting release the inner buddy in all of us. We must certainly hope that helping to extend cultural understanding will not narrow human sympathies, but in fact there may be no necessary connection in either direction. Almost all arguments that seem to suggest that scholarship, science, or culture turn their practitioners into better people are awkwardly vulnerable to obvious counter-examples. Just think of the inhabitants of any departmental corridor. So I think the discipline-free play of the mind over any given topic that is at the heart of scholarly and scientific inquiry is principally best talked about in terms of being an intellectual or cognitive achievement and not directly a moral one, and that the primary activity of universities is not, I think, best couched as the manufacture of right-mindedness. Now, turning away from the activity of justification to the category of the humanities itself, again, I want to be a little cautious about our usage here. Obviously, we need the label for certain purposes, but we also recognize that it's principally an organizational or classifying term, a flag of convenience when sailing in certain institutional waters. And that's, of course, one reason why we should be rather cautious about being too essentialist, too essentialist about it. We should surely be careful not to reify it, to speak of it as a single discipline, and we should certainly not speak as though it were a timeless category. Not only is it a term that only came into general currency in its modern sense in the mid-20th century, but it did so largely by way of a reaction to the imperial claims of the scientific positivism of that period as supposedly embodied in the natural and social sciences. And perhaps it's never quite shaken off the aura of conservatism and defensiveness that were inherited from these origins, and it seems to me important not to endorse either of those associations. I should just add that although the term has been well established in Britain for some decades, it's fair to say, I think, that the discourse about the humanities has had and continues to have a particularly intimate connection with the characteristically American conception of the liberal arts education, and I'll come back to that question of relation to undergraduate teaching in a moment. So one of the risks attendant upon trying to define some essential character of the humanities is that we may end up enshrining some revamped version of the two cultures. And this has been a distorting and damaging tradition of discourse ever since C.P. Snow christened it. And in many, perhaps even in most settings, it seems to me much more helpful, and in fact much more accurate, to emphasize what the humanities disciplines share with those in the social and natural sciences. After all, great swathes of our activities are drawing on some of the same standards of rigor, use of evidence and analysis, and standards of accuracy. And more generally, the right tactics when supposedly defending the humanities against some kind of perceived external threat or criticism may be to defend the institution of the university as a whole. It is the whole enterprise of the disinterested and disciplined extension of human understanding that's at issue, and the humanities, I think, have everything to gain from cultivating a tactical and actual solidarity with our neighbors in other disciplines. Another way in which treating the humanities as a single intellectual enterprise risks misleading us is that it almost always ends up focusing on the great books, and usually, therefore, reducing our diverse disciplines to the study of a few classics of literature and philosophy. This is one of the places where an exclusive emphasis on undergraduate education can be unhelpful when discussing this topic, since it tends to lead us to neglect the variety of what we do in scholarship and research. Even in literature and philosophy, and still more in other fields, most scholars, most of the time, are not reading the great books, but are engaging in some much more analytical or empirical inquiries, focusing on particular times and places. And our account of the humanities should, I think, reflect this. But even then, constantly emphasizing the category of the humanities still, I think, tends to operate at too high a level of abstraction, flattening out the distinctiveness of individual disciplines and losing what may be the most impressive and persuasive things about good pieces of work in, say, ancient history or Renaissance musicology or 19th century Russian literature, and so on. Individual disciplines, after all, are not merely accidents of institutional history. There are long and rich cultural traditions behind thinking about literature or religion or art and so on, and we need to harness the strength of those traditions to support the standing of the current forms of these inquiries. So, as a matter of tactics, it can often be more productive, I think, to try to illustrate what is valuable about particular pieces of work in moral philosophy in its terms, literary criticism in its terms, and so on. Let me make two concluding points. First, as scholars, we do, I think, need to make a greater effort to try to provide politicians, officials, journalists, administrators, and other public figures with a usable set of descriptions that we think accurately describe what we do. In market democracies such as ours, politicians are acutely conscious of the kinds of justification for public expenditure which it believes the electorate will find acceptable. At present, as we all know, the received wisdom in the policy-making world is that the only criterion with undisputed legitimacy across the board is contributing to economic prosperity. This situation is obviously potentially unfavorable to the humanities in various ways, but one less obvious danger arises, I think, if we allow an external vocabulary of justification to come to provide an internal criterion of quality. If research in the humanities is valuable to society, as I suspect all speakers are going to say that we believe it is, it makes a contribution by extending and deepening our understanding of human activities across times and cultures. And if we divert our energies from doing that to the highest possible standard in order to meet a perceived short-term requirement to contribute economic impact, we shall, I think, in fact, be lessening the social contribution of scholarly research. And the more we acquiesce in these crude measures of social and economic impact, the more such categories colonize our minds. And certainly one of the more depressing features of recent debate in Britain, I think, is how academics have started to internalize the language of contribution to economic growth as their sense of their defining purpose. And my second and last point is that alarmism, defensiveness, and the alienation of public support are clearly related. There are, as I've said, many publics, and we should not underestimate the level of interest in and enthusiasm for work in the humanities disciplines in various quarters of society. Among several of these publics, there is an instinctive recognition that unfettered intellectual inquiry is central to what universities are about, and that therefore there is potentially a much greater reservoir of interest in and latent appreciation of the work of universities than the narrow and instrumental official discourse about economic growth ever succeeds in tapping into. And it's noticeable, and surely it's regrettable, how little the public debate about universities in contemporary society makes much appeal to this widespread appreciation on the part of ordinary intelligent fellow citizens that there should be places where these kinds of inquiries are being pursued at their highest level. Part of the problem may be that while universities are spectacularly good at producing new forms of understanding, they are not always so good at explaining what they are doing when they do this. And this is where alarmism is particularly unhelpful. The mere fact that a smaller proportion of students may take courses in the humanities and a larger proportion in business or communication or something else does not seem to me in itself to spell disaster. So instead of digging ourselves in behind a stockade of overambitious claims couched at too high a level of abstraction and delivered in a tone of defensiveness, I think it's better to start from some of the facts of our actual practice in our actual diverse disciplines and work up from there. The kinds of understanding and judgment exercised in those disciplines are of a piece with the kinds of understanding and judgment involved in living a life. We should recognize that that, in the end, is part of why they interest us and seem worthwhile, and perhaps we then need to acknowledge that any subsequent attempts at justification in other terms must start from and build on that recognition. In trying to justify the humanities, as in trying to live a life, what may turn out to matter most is holding one's nerve. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you so much for that anti-essentialist, ground-up, non-justificatory defense of the humanities. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Because I'm going to try to go over a number of things in a very short period of time, I thought I'd start by listing to you simply my four main points. I'm first going to talk about and in some ways they echo what you have just heard, but in a very different register. I'm going to talk about the structural conditions affecting the university as a whole and ask the question why it is that democratization of the university breeds public discontent. Second, I'm going to talk about why the humanities take the brunt of this discontent. Third, I'm going to talk about why it seems that the social sciences do better in attracting students than the humanities for reasons that may not be the usual ones. And then fourth, I'm going to raise the issue of the canon and ask the question whether we have won the battles of the culture wars and lost the war itself. So, first, long-term structural trends. Democratization, just to show you that it is true that we continue to offer university education to a higher and higher percentage of students. This has not stopped. I actually expected to see that it had slowed down, but it actually has not slowed down. But it takes a different form. The university has become a different thing. Baldly speaking, between the 1950s and the 1970s, we saw a vast expansion of the regular faculty. Between the 1980s and now, we see, I wanted to blame it on the vast expansion of administration, but the data seems to instead suggest a vast expansion of the university infrastructure and probably an expansion as well of temporary faculty. So the total number of institutional employees has continually gone up. What I find most striking is the rise in what is called professional staff over time. Now, the total staff has gone up, the number of the faculty has gone up, the administration has gone up, but I think what is really striking is those other professionals, which is human resource people, the lawyers associated with the university, all of the things that these are things that I think are part of what is making the university more and more expensive to run. And it is this expensiveness, I think, that accounts for a fair amount of public discontent. In many cases, at least certainly in the public universities, delivering less teaching by regular faculty for higher and higher tuition. I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is going to be one of my big themes because I'm going to stress a gender theme, that two-income families have increasingly become the norm. BAs are now required for many forms of work that in the past would have been accessible to high school graduates. The bar has been constantly raised in educational terms, but graduating students do not find themselves better off, and families find themselves in enormous debt. And as Stefan also mentioned, this discontent is widely shared in the Western world. This is not an American phenomenon. This is going over, certainly on all over Western Europe at exactly the same time. So why do the humanities take the brunt of this criticism? In part for structural reasons, I want to argue. Obviously, they bring in less outside money. This makes them the easiest target for consolidation and dismantling from within the university. But it is also the case that they are the most feminized part of the university, and that is usually associated with the least status And anybody who has studied this at their own institution or more generally knows that this is absolutely true as measured in terms of salaries. Those departments that have the largest proportion of women are paid less per person than those that have the least proportion of women. At Harvard, I must also mention that the university itself is also becoming increasingly feminized, that is, associated with women. Now, I want to make a paradoxical argument, though, that as women entered the university, they didn't do what was expected. They actually switched from education and the humanities, the courses that they took when they didn't enter the job market after the university, to the social sciences and business. And I have to say, I think about this especially because Liz Cohen was one of those first women who went to Princeton University, and this has been studied in greatest detail, actually, in the case of Princeton, which as an institution thought that by admitting women, it was going to really beef up the humanities. And instead, women went into the professional choices that we are now familiar with. So this can be quite precisely dated, and this is a massive change in the university around the late 70s, when more and more of the students were women and fewer proportionately of the students were men. Now, part of this is due to the overall increase in enrollment. Part of it is due to social changes that have taken place that are very important. I thank your own Mary Waters for drawing my attention to this particular article, which says that most of the movement in choice of discipline away from the humanities towards the social sciences, business, and other fields is attributable to the shift in the choices of female students. So you have the paradox of an increasingly feminized university, but at the same time, women who are moving into other fields. So this leads to a very interesting situation. So just a few charts to make my point about what are the feminized fields. It's a kind of ugly word, and if I could think of a better one, or if you can think of a better one, tell me and I will start using it in the future. Just to show you the difference, that even history, my own field, still has more PhDs, male PhDs, than female PhDs, whereas, of course, this is not true in the foreign languages and English, where the proportions are very different, and much of what goes on in the university happens as a result. Okay, my third point, then, why the social sciences do better in attracting students. I don't think it is because they are less feminized, but I think one of the factors that often doesn't get brought up is how much more successful they are at attracting minorities, the other big new group in the university. This is just to give you an idea of the fact that the social sciences and history taken together have a lot of PhDs compared to most of the humanities department. But to show you the increasing importance of minorities in the university in the last few decades. But what happens then? BAs, minorities by sex and field. I think the evidence is pretty clear that minorities are much more attracted to the social sciences. They are not particularly attracted to my field, history, in comparison to sociology, anthropology, economics, and political science. And the humanities, along with history, don't do that well in attracting minority students. Similarly, with PhDs, where the same pattern also obtains with PhD minorities by sex and field. Now, the biggest problem, I would argue, in the humanities, insofar as there is a problem in the humanities, and I don't really want to talk about this in a defensive way, but just to identify what some of the issues might be, I think it's important to recognize that English departments in general are not doing that badly. They are not the ones that administrators are trying to consolidate into other departments, as is the case with foreign languages and literature, where I think there is really an issue on the agenda. So just to give you an example, the disproportion here between English and French, I am in French history, so I'm especially interested in the fate of French. English had a period of dip overall in the country and has definitely consolidated itself since then. So why are some fields prospering within the humanities, and others not so much. I was only able to find data from my own university, so I thought I would show it. I thought I would show it to you, and you see here that English does quite well. It has between 300 and 400 majors per year, but history and political science have even more. French has been pretty much stagnant, and I want you to just note that philosophy has actually improved its situation. So one of my questions is, why would that happen? And why would there be a difference in fates in departments? Well, I think part of this has to do with the canon issue. That is, fields with canons have faced an extra hurdle in remaking themselves for the contemporary setting. And so the question is, what is it about the canon? Are canons under fire because of democratization? Is that because of the democratization of the faculty or of the student body? And so I will conclude by just saying a few words on the subject of the canon. My argument is that cultural studies has been incredibly successful at challenging social science paradigms by arguing for the autonomy and influence of culture, but that there has been a problem in reducing culture to something else, namely oppression, which I think has this is a huge issue. I'm putting it out there in an extremely schematic fashion, and I think this is one of the things that has happened to the canon. It has been undermined by the criticisms, many of them perfectly justified, of it. So the question is what to do about this. Philosophy departments, at least in my experience at UCLA, have gone over to a different kind of approach. They emphasize much more skills as opposed to the canon that they may have started out with but have long since left behind. So maybe it's just a question of when you leave behind the canon. But to conclude, I just want to show how much things have changed, and perhaps we can discuss this later. This is the current requirement in Harvard's own English department for the concentration. 3 common ground courses are the basic requirement for the English major. You see that they are not associated with any familiar names from the history of English literature. I leave you to draw whatever conclusions you want to about this description. But to put it into context, admittedly an extremely extreme context, I looked up the requirements for admission to Harvard's freshman class in 1852. This is the requirement to get into Harvard in 1852 of all incoming students in every field, from mathematics to whatever. And I just want you to note that this was truly the canon at its high point, in the sense that there was seen to be a body of knowledge that every single student ought to know before they even started. And it's a familiar canon to us, and I think it's an interesting point of departure about whether the humanities needs to have a canon or what it's going to do about not having a canon. Thank you very much.
Lynn, thank you very much. I'll make a point of mentioning it to the chair of our department that we have Worcester's elements of history and elements of geography as an entry condition for our department. This is very useful. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here, Homi. I'm very pleased to be here. I will not take Stefan's advice all that close to heart because I intend to be somewhat alarmist, although I will speak to a specific discipline, my own. And I want to discuss with you today the global dimension of the humanities, which people normally don't address, although I should have anticipated that Homi would anticipate me about this. My thoughts are the following. If universities are to act globally, and I think most universities now feel that they must do so, and rightly so, then they must think globally. And if the humanities are to have any role to play in this acting and thinking, we need to understand both what the world means for the humanities in America today and how to enhance that pitiable quotient, as well as what is going on elsewhere in the global humanities and how to work together to improve that. For our fates, this is an important point I want to make, our fates are deeply intertwined with the fates of our colleagues around the world. Second, we want, and I think need to understand how the new technologies can help or harm this global humanities situation. My third point is what it means for the American university today to enact globalism in its teaching and research. And here I concentrate on the relationship between disciplines and areas that has long bedeviled universities, including my own. I approach this problem from the perspective of my own discipline because it's the poster child for everything that's wrong with the present university and all that can be made right in the future one. People like me, you just saw the slide, who a century ago bestrode the university like a colossus, now sit at the bottom of the great chain of academic being. I'm a student of the non-West, that's the first strike. I'm a student of the non-modern, that's the second strike. And I'm a philologist, and that's third strike. Philology, or the discipline of making sense of language, whether the language forms or texts are written or oral, printed or electronic, expressive or prosaic, ancient or contemporary, represents, along with philosophy, which is the discipline of making sense of thought, a basic science of the humanities, but also the most endangered science. If we successfully address the problem of philology, we'll go some way in addressing the problem of the humanities in the future university. So to my three topics, and I want to start with the global situation of the humanities. I thought more people would discuss the humanities indicators. I don't want to go through that in great detail, but the smallest of fractions of people who are getting PhDs in the humanities are doing non-Western, non-modern studies. And the conclusion one draws from such statistics is that the portion of the professoriate responsible for understanding, curating, and transmitting the first 4,500 years of human consciousness and the multiple ways of being human that those texts and documents offer to us stand in almost exactly inverse proportion to the magnitude and importance of the object. This may seem bad when you're looking at it from the American perspective, but looking around the world, there are really some astonishing developments in the past 50 years in the world of knowledge, which reverse, in my view, millennia of engagement that endangers the world's humanities capacity. There had never been a formal assessment of this. There are no statistics. It's very difficult to get data, and most of my evidence is anecdotal. This emerges out of a nascent Columbia Global Humanities project. But let me give you a couple of snapshots from around the world. In sub-Saharan Africa in 1986, the World Bank and IMF urged governments in Africa to defund the universities in favor of K-12 education. And as a result of that, the humanities were completely decimated, so much so that the Carnegie Endowment a few years ago, pardon me, wrote that there's a serious debate now whether the humanities in Africa can even continue to exist. Colleagues in the Arab world who work on the Arab world have described the situation of the humanities there as wilted, dismal, and wretched. In many places, this is the result of the fact that the authoritarian and religious politics in play there forbids criticism or deviation from established narratives, a trend that's growing even in the once more liberal Gulf states. As for philology, which once had a great tradition in the Arab world, this has given way to extreme sectarianization, with Shiites publishing Shiite works, Saudis, Salafi works, and so on. In South Asia, my own area of interest, which as recently as the Midnight of Freedom in 1947 could boast of expertise in dozens of classical languages in the subcontinent, today the landscape is really blasted. I mean, it's virtually impossible to find anyone, with few exception of a few languages, where there's any competence in classical studies at all. What is really at risk here is 3,000 years of literature in a dozen languages, the longest continuous and richest multicultural literary record in world history. The capacity to understand that record will, I believe, within a generation, have reached a statistical zero. The redirection of resources and prestige to science and technology that's partly responsible for this situation in India and elsewhere is known as the Singapore model, which dictates that education should first and foremost serve the economic interests of the state. In Singapore, and this is now the case in Malaysia, Vietnam, Cambodia, and elsewhere, humanistic intellectual pursuits have been relegated to what some colleagues call university ghettos, while attempts to curtail basic education in literature, philosophy, history in high schools continues. So in some places, you have externalities like IMF diktats. In other places, internalities like political or religious authority. Everywhere, state commitment to science and technology, which, if economically necessary, is also politically safe for most of these places, have left the humanities in a shambles. In addition, everywhere one confronts rote learning, lack of analysis and critique. Most students enter the humanities because they have no other options, and they leave the humanities with no job prospects. The one exception is perhaps China and Taiwan, where a very different model has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years. What's not clear to me, having visited Fudan and other places in China not too long ago, is whether, in fact, the core of the humanities, acquiring the capacity to think independently and openly about the issues that affect one's life, is being preserved in China as well. Now, let me go on to my second topic, having quickly surveyed the problem of the global humanities. And this has to do with the new technology. And my question is, does the new technology render the image that I've offered of the humanities completely meaningless? Isn't the kind of work that people like me, philologists, non-modern, non-Western philologists, believe that philology is something like a basic science of the humanities, isn't that kind of work antiquated and being replaced by newer kinds of digital, cognitive, evolutionary, biological humanities? Second, don't things like the massive open online courses solve the problem of the diminishing humanities capacity in the non-West? I'll have to be very brief and declamatory, as I typically am. Digital humanities, and I speak this as someone who's running a big digital humanities project at Columbia, far from being a new form of knowledge, is simply a mechanized way of doing what humanists have always done. It's a tool. It's not different from, it's not a different form or substance of the humanities. Big data does not ask questions. Big data only can answer questions that you bring to it from more primary, basic forms of disciplinary knowledge, such as philology. Now, what about massive online open courses? Are they going to save the humanities? The numbers are astonishing. I was hearing about Greg Naj's course, really astonishing numbers, 70,000 kids in a world history course at Princeton, and so on. But there are real problems here, which I want to address very schematically. There is another kind of massive open course in existence for a long time. It's called the book. And books, in fact, I do believe that the book will eventually, something like the National Digital Libraries Project that people here at Harvard are involved with, or my own Multi-Classical Library of India initiative through Harvard University Press, which will offer free ebooks of all of our publications, maybe in the long run far more important for the humanities than MOOCs. Secondly, these massive courses, like the digital humanities, they are simply tools and techniques, not arguments and ideas. They may add a new level to the humanities game, but don't actually change the rules. But here is the most important point that I want to lay a great deal of stress on. How much more difficult is it going to be for our colleagues in Africa or India if African philosophy or Indian literature is taught not locally, but from the metropolitan center? The issue is especially important for the humanities, as it's not for statistics or artificial intelligence, because how Indians interpret their literature or Africans their philosophy is part of the object of study of the humanities. Those forms of reception are part of what humanists are interested in studying, whereas African statisticians or Indian engineers, what they think about statistics or AI is not related to their time and place whatsoever. Why even bother to develop humanities capacity in Uganda or Karnataka if edX will do it for you? There's a really strong analogy to be drawn, it seems like from left field, but listen to me for a second, with NAFTA. When NAFTA came into play, the 3 types of genetically modified corn that are produced very cheaply in the United States flooded the Mexican market, and the 50 to 60 cultivars that had been over millennia developed by Mexican farmers have been slowly destroyed. I think there's something very, very comparable to what's possible with these massive online courses. In the same way, not only must we avoid crushing the humanities economies of the South, but we require the views, we require the participation of the people whose humanistic traditions we are studying. If the humanities are going to matter to a future university, the people from the studied regions will have to be made co-custodians of the accumulated knowledge that concerns them. If MOOCs are going to be part of this project, they'll have to become areas or arenas of collaboration rather than monopolies. Now, I want to go to the last point having to do with areas and disciplines. The big context for my thinking about this is what I see as the transformation of foundations and universities over the last 10 to 15 years from knowledge producing to problem solving. There are serious problems to solve. I'm not denying that. But as Craig Calhoun, the director of LSE, put it not too long ago, foundations and increasingly universities are trying to work, this is a quote, trying to work directly to pursue change, usually without any lengthy detour through attempts to improve knowledge. For humanists who don't solve problems in the same way, in fact, we sometimes see our job as making problems by asking primary ontological questions. This context makes for a very steep uphill battle. Hardly more manageable is the question concerning global knowledge, which, above and beyond the provincialization that we're encountering everywhere in the United States, is being endangered by the way it's organized in the American university. We are as confused as ever about regions and their relationships to disciplines, how to produce knowledge in each, and where to go from what seems to me the current state of paralysis. The uneasy relationship between areas and disciplines, between ideographic and nomothetic knowledge that came to a head in the past decade has been solved, in quotation marks, by the marginalization or even exile of area-based social scientists from the disciplines. At the same time, the problem of the small, antiquated, annoying language and literature department, particularly of the non-West, which are the detritus of a philology that long ago lost its discipline, has been solved by the relocation of these refugee scholars, creating modernized, upgraded studies programs. While these programs offer new conversation possibilities, and I'm part of such a group, the humanists are typically pushed right to the margins, while the social science disciplines themselves have reverted to their European origins. Now, how is it a university that takes the humanities seriously to respond to these tensions? Let me just say a few words about philology, which no longer exists as a discipline in any American university. It's been dispersed across the university the same way as mathematics has been dispersed, except mathematics as a disciplinary home. I think no other form of knowledge is suited to the future university as philology. I'm going to reserve the arguments for why that's the case for later in our discussion. But let me just close with some modest, or rather outlandish proposals about philology, the non-West, and the future of the humanities and the future of the university. My first outlandish proposal is that universities should create new departments of philology to teach the global history and theory of making sense of texts, whether we're talking about the Mahabharata or rap lyrics, and there's some fascinating databases for rap lyrics which do deep philological work, or the US Constitution. A philology course should be required of every undergraduate in every American university so that no future Supreme Court justice could ever assert the way Justice Scalia did, that words just mean what they mean. In addition, all undergraduates should be strongly encouraged to study 4 years of a non-Western, non-modern language. Doesn't matter, Arabic, Hausa, Tamil, it doesn't matter, even Sanskrit. If people want to understand what the humanities do for us, most importantly, perhaps, to help us see the world through someone else's eyes, there is no more compelling way than learning such a language, and the further away from here and now, the better. All postgraduate degrees should henceforth be joint. Students in the disciplines require the grounded knowledge and new theoretical possibilities offered by studies programs, and humanities students in studies programs require a foundation in a philology or other humanistic discipline. Of course, without that, interdisciplinarity is just hollow. For the same reason, all faculty should be jointly appointed and departments should stop acting like British men's clubs. If the future university is going, and I'll close with this, if the future university is going to be a global university, and if the humanities are to have a place in it, we must begin to take the global situation of the humanities far more seriously than we have been doing. We must understand the dangers as well as the opportunities of the new technologies and use them to develop more intensive collaborations with our colleagues around the world. And we must seriously reinvent the relationship of areas and disciplines, re-arealize the disciplines, and rediscipline the areas to ensure that both become part of the training of every student and indeed of every teacher. Thank you so much.
Diana Sorensen.
Well, let me start by thanking President Faust for convening us and the Mahindra Humanities Center for gathering us here today, and the Radcliffe Institute for its hospitality. My remarks today are very practical and very located. They are bound to the particulars of my location as Dean for Arts and Humanities in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. It's a perch which allows me to follow faculty and student movement, as well as general disciplinary contours and shifts. It is remarkable that we inhabit pretty fixed structures, departments, centers, divisions, schools, even as we are constantly adjusting to ever-changing intellectual landscapes in terms of interdisciplinarity and the organization of units of geographic coherence, which I think no longer map comfortably onto the area studies models of the post-war era. Tectonic shifts have been occurring as we've gone about our business of teaching and research in the university, and we are all now inhabiting a changed landscape. Now, let me briefly mention some of those shifts. At a funding level, and that's been referred to earlier, recent decades have witnessed reasons for alarm. Alarm among, sorry, Homi, our humanistic colleagues. I won't use the word C, the C word. In terms of federal funding, the allocation for the humanities has diminished drastically. In 1979, the dollar value of NSF grants was 5 times greater than grants from the NEH. By 1997, NSF grants were 33 times larger than NEH grants. And according to the NSF's 2005 annual survey of research and development expenditures at universities and colleges, total spending for science and engineering research was almost 46 billion, over 46 times humanities research and development expenditures. The understandably high costs of scientific research do little to comfort humanists as they witness their own budgets shrinking in the post-2008 environment. And then, of course, there is the question of student debt, which at $3 trillion is becoming a source of enormous national anxiety about deliverables and impact, something I know our president has to deal with and defend the university against. And then on campus, there is the question of our audience. If we think of the university as a conversation devoted to the production and dissemination of knowledge and the reflection about human purpose and meaning, perhaps what I find most elusive from my observation post at this time are our interlocutors. Humanities concentrations record the highest levels of student satisfaction in those surveys that are made to tell us so much, but student traffic and choices remain hard to direct and anticipate. A certain instrumental imperative is favoring what is construed as practical knowledge, and the liberal arts seem to be taking on a pre-professional edge. Even more intriguing is a condition that has been described as constant partial attention, with that radical shift in concentration patterns that we see among our colleagues and certainly among our students. And this, of course, is caused by multiple shifting stimuli. I would not presume to tell Eric Hobsbawm what to call the 21st century, but it does strike me that the age of extremes is begetting the age of impatience. And I understand that in the business environment, they talk about this time as being a VUCA time. It's volatile, it's unpredictable, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. The authority of data, charts, the bottom line, and bullet points rests on the appeal of processing speed. Now, the humanities take more time, not only to read prose or poetry, but also to trace the twists and turns of argumentation, reasoning, opinion, and judgment. We compare interpretations, we acknowledge our personal bias and emotional investment as readers of texts. And we believe that this intellectual disposition is good for training citizens that need to understand our complex world before plunging into action and problem solving. Now, here at Harvard, my committed humanist colleagues and I have spent a year and a half together actively addressing these questions about thinking, writing, and action. And many of you are here today, and I salute you. We have called this process the Humanities Project, and I would like you to conjure up the image of us all wearing hard hats, busily digging, building bridges, pathways, and gateways, leading to a welcoming citadel, or as Homi might put it, a commons that sits in a crossroads. Let me say a few words then about the landscape we hope to shape so as to re-energize the university conversation with other disciplines. We want to work with other disciplines in the sciences, the social sciences, and the professional schools, while highlighting the rigor and disciplinary specificity of our own humanistic fields. There's a working group on the condition of the humanities that has written an admirable document, and here I want to recognize James Simpson, Sean Kelly, Homi Bhabha. This document will be released after we share it with President Faust and Dean Smith. It forcefully and eloquently states what the humanities are for, to quote from Stefan Collini's eloquent book title. I would not do justice to its nuanced historical documentation by summarizing it, but it does make it clear that the humanities enable us to engage with, understand, evaluate, and transform the world and its meanings. It cannily addresses detractors and the challenges we are facing with enrollments by tracing trends that go back to the 50s and comparing divisional data so as to capture a precise snapshot of our current condition. We have studied surveys of student interest, their anticipated majors when they enter college, gender ratios, tuition assistant correlations, satisfaction levels on campus, as well as years after graduation, attrition and departure to other divisions. We have discovered, for example, that medical schools, law schools, and business schools take a real interest in our students, who do very well in terms of acceptance rates. Two numbers here. National Medical School acceptance rates, 50% are humanities majors, 63% of law school enrollments are English majors. We have identified a first set of action items that will organize our efforts around the first 3 semesters of our undergraduate's academic life. And we're constructing courses and related initiatives that add up to a concrete action plan. Here again, imagine us with our hard hats on, aiming at this audience that we are interpellating. And I'll say just a few brief things about our working groups. We are trying to create both a culture of collaboration in the division and to invent courses that will appeal to our students by asking them to defamiliarize the usual, whether it's reading, looking, or listening. There are courses also that pose the big questions that we believe our students come to college seeking answers for. And then we are beginning to think about crossroads courses, courses where the particular expertise of the humanities comes into dialogue with the particular expertise of other fields. And Homi is already working on those. We've heard about, for example, courses in the question of the medical humanities. And these are not just friendly, fuzzy conversations. We want to bring the disciplines into very strong engagement and even contestation. There are a number of other initiatives that we are undertaking. They're quite practical. It may mean reaching out to admitted students. It may mean rethinking the nature of freshman seminars and a lot of the culture of siloed units that tend to isolate not only colleagues but also students. But what I want to say in closing is that what the Humanities Project has taught me is the value of a committed community of generous scholars. This year and a half has had us contending with differences of opinion, with debate, with the need to reach compromise, with reports that needed to be adjusted and modified. We've taken so many steps that I think are exemplary of the kind of engagement that today's world, mired in what I would call a crisis of understanding, what this world needs is more of that collective engagement, that willingness to think through and then make the changes. So I will end my remarks with a note of deep optimism about the human fabric here, as well as deep gratitude. And I do think that with everybody's attention, we will change things in very productive ways. So thanks to everybody that's been part of the project.
Thank you very much. President Larry Bacow.
Well, first, let me thank Homi for the invitation to be part of this panel discussion. I feel like I'm the token non-humanist at this party, and so in the interest of full disclosure, let me tell you that my remarks are those of someone who has tried to actually run one of these strange beasts, strange, wonderful beasts that we call a university. And I must also confess that I'm influenced by my own disciplinary biases, because I am, in fact, trained as an economist and as a lawyer. I think we live in interesting times, and since the title of this session is The Humanities and the Future of the University, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the future of the university, because we must locate the humanities within that. And then we can talk about what that future looks like for the humanities, what we might do in support of the humanities, how we might do better. But I think it's worthwhile to at least pause and ask, what is the future of the university right now, and what are the winds that are buffeting all of us? I tend to look at education, and in fact research, scholarship, as being both, from an individual and a societal perspective, both investment and consumption. We study some things, both as individuals and as a society, because we think that they are going to improve our lot economically. We think that they are going to make us wealthier as individuals or a society. This is the investment component of what we do. But we also, education and scholarship are also consumption. By that I mean we study some things not because we expect an economic return. We expect in some ways, I would like to argue, a higher return. We study them because they help us to understand and appreciate the world around us in ways that nothing else will do. They help us to, as others have said far more eloquently than I can, become better people. They help us to become a better society. They help us to prepare to assume the responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. I would argue difficult to put a dollar value on these things, but immensely valuable to society as a whole. Unfortunately, for many of the reasons that I think Diana has already articulated, we live in a world where the cost of an education is increasing quite dramatically. And I think that as the real cost of education and the real cost of the scholarly enterprise has increased so dramatically, what's happened is that we've taken a far more instrumental view of both what an education is all about and what a university is all about. And so we tend to look only, or perhaps not only, that's too strong, but far more at the investment dimensions of what we do and far less at the others. That's not going to go away. Because if we talk about the future of the university, I think we're talking about a future that probably includes less, not more in the way of public support. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But given the fiscal realities of the world that we live in, I think we need to expect that. We live in a world in which we are going to be held to far greater standards of accountability for what we do, not less. Again, I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think that's a terribly provocative statement. We live in a world in which the university is going to have to partner with far more institutions in our society than we have traditionally done. We find ourselves working far more closely with industry, for example. We find our host communities demanding more of us. Again, this is the world that we're living in. I'm not arguing that this is good or bad, but this is the future, and we need to understand it in these dimensions. I could go on in describing more changes that I think will affect how it is that universities conduct themselves in the future. So what does that say, though, for the role of the humanities within this institution? Well, it means that, like every function of the university, we are likely to have to do more with less. There will be more demands for accountability. There will be higher expectations of collaboration, more expected of all of us. By the way, our colleagues who toil in the fields of science wring their hands about many of the same concerns. In fact, scientists, our scholarly colleagues who are theoretical physicists, for example, who study theoretical mathematics, wring their hands over the fact that we seem to be taken up by the notion merely of translational research. All of inquiry-based research is being questioned right now, not just inquiry-based research, I would suggest, in the humanities. And this is a challenge for all of us. I mention this because, again, from the perspective of a university president, one often gets the feeling, and it's been better articulated than I can do myself, that humanists feel particularly under assault at the moment. But I would like to point out that part of this represents just what all of the university, all of the scholarly community is dealing with. To be certain, the consequences do not fall equally on all disciplines, and I don't mean to suggest that they do, but there are consequences for all of us. Now, in an environment in which more is being expected of us across the board, I think we need to ask, what is it that the humanities can do and respond in this context? And I'm often struck by the fact that I think the most fundamental issues which we are facing as a society in some ways can never be answered by scientists or social scientists. But in fact, the conversation can certainly be elevated by humanists. I think, for example, about the debate which this country is engaging in right now over the federal deficit. At its core, the debate over the federal deficit has to do with the responsibilities of one generation towards future generations. Okay? Not something which scientists are going to answer, or indeed, I would argue, social scientists. Philosophers have a lot to say about that subject. Similarly, much of the discussion, certainly not all, but much of the discussion over climate change has essentially the same character to it. Because among reasonable thinking people, and now I'm displaying my biases, most of the science is reasonably settled. How we deal with the science is very much open to debate. We're fighting wars over tensions between fundamentalism and modernity. And those wars are not just being fought abroad. In some ways, we are struggling with exactly the same issues in this country, but in different contexts. Again, something which I think we can all agree is not going to be informed or greatly elevated purely by the inquiry of social scientists, of engineers or others, but humanists have a particular contribution to make. So I then asked myself, why is it that it seems so hard? And I'm sorry if I offend. Why is it that it seems so hard when some of us tried to engage our colleagues from the humanities to collaborate on such issues? And to be certain, some are interested. And I've thought a little bit about this. And the conclusion that I draw is that one of the things that makes humanists is their desire to pursue their scholarship, often individually. It's a less, I mean, again, at the risk of offending, the traditions of collaboration exist far greater in other disciplines than I think they do in the humanities. And this is something which I think we need to think about, because I think this is something in a university which is going to be called upon to do more, to address problems of enormous complexity, to respond to the needs of society, to marshal all of its resources. We lose as institutions when we fail to engage our colleagues in the humanities to the degree which I think we need to the degree to which I think we must do. So I would like to suggest that as we think about the humanities and the future of the university, we think about a much larger role, in fact, than perhaps we have traditionally done. One in which humanists more often are working not in isolation, but are working side by side with their colleagues in other disciplines. I'd actually like to close my remarks, and I want to keep them brief because I'm sure the conversation that we're going to have from the audience is going to be much more interesting than our own, by saying that I also think that we have done our students a disservice sometimes when we have failed to help them understand that their careers are not defined by what it is that they major in college. I used to welcome students to Tufts at matriculation every year by picking out just a few examples among the alumni of our institution, highly visible alumni, people that everybody knew, and then I would tell them what these alumni studied as undergraduates. And it was always really interesting. I would point out that Jeff Kindler, who at the time was running the largest pharmaceutical company in the world, Pfizer, was an English major at Tufts. I would point out that the senior-most woman at the time at IBM, Abby Constam, was a dance major when she studied at Tufts. And I would continue on with a long list. I think it's incumbent upon each and every one of us to help our students and their parents who are paying the bills understand that they come here for an education, that the things which they will study during their 4 years as undergraduates will not necessarily define their careers going forward, but in fact, if they think of them in the right way, will only open up a world of possibilities. That's our responsibility to do, and we need to do it better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Bacow. Thank you very much. You've been a very attentive audience, and I intend to open up to questions very quickly. But before I do that, can I just ask you to address, the panel to address, certain paradoxes and contradictions that seem to have emerged. Everybody wants education for their children. Nobody says, if they can afford it, I don't care about it. Everybody wants it. It seems to be a desire that is quite universal. Why then does university education and the economics of university education always become a contentious issue, particularly in the arts and humanities? yeah, these people don't teach, they hang around. Sometimes they used to take pot, now they don't take pot, but they read old books. Why is it that university education always needs particular justification, specifically in the humanities? Everybody wants an education. Particularly if you say, President Bacow, that you used to consistently say it doesn't matter what you do as an undergraduate. What you do as an undergraduate broadens the economic. But still there is a particular smell attached to the humanities. It's not economic, it's not, so I'm just interested in why that is the case. Let me just add, and then you can take some of these around. Secondly, we talk about global humanities, we talk about the global world in which we live, and yet there is a shrinkage in precisely those areas that we need in order to be able to translate cultures and work in them. So at the moment where we talk about globalization, everything that equips us to be global cultural citizens in the humanities shrinks and is again treated as if it's an optional extra. The third issue that I just wanted to bring up is the fact that if indeed the economic argument hangs so heavily, isn't it clear then that humanities students will want to think about their careers in terms of end-oriented, job-oriented futures, so that, you know, we can keep trying to make these things as attractive as possible, but if the dominance of this in our culture, if this whole idea of economic success and the economy as being so fundamental to running the society is such a strong idea, naturally students are going to, after the first year or so, try and gravitate towards subjects where they feel they will actually get a job more easily. These are issues, I think, that have emerged in each of the discussions. And then I think there's a larger area about how we reorganize knowledge and possibly reorganize departmental, the departmental structure of our knowledge. So any of these issues, I think if we could just take up even briefly before we open up, I'd be grateful. Yeah, Shelley.
Just very, very quickly, I think it's important to sort of historicize all of these issues. These are relatively new developments globally, I think. Certainly in a place like India, it's only in the last 50 or 60 years that these transformations have been noticed, and it's not possible to disconnect them from a sort of vast ideology of modernization that's been put in place certainly since India's become independent. And you know, it's just as modernization became a state project, so it can be undone in some sense. I remember Andy Abbott, a sociologist at the University of Chicago, gave a fabulous presentation several years ago to incoming undergraduates, and he pointed out with very rich statistical evidence that what you study at the University of Chicago College as an undergraduate major, even the grades you get, have virtually no correlation with your later career choices. In fact, the only thing that is important is getting into the University of Chicago College. Once you've done that, you've won the game. So I guess what I'm saying is that just as certain forms of thinking have produced our current malaise, so certain forms of unthinking can change them.
Thank you, Sheldon.
Just one general point about the issues that Homi raised. It's very easy, I think, when we're concentrating on what we're aware of as changes in our time, to contrast that with an unchanging previous state. Whereas, in fact, all of these issues and all of these debates themselves have a long history, and universities have been adapting to changes in their society for as long as there have been universities. Sometimes when I'm reading some of the literature at the moment about the humanities, I'm very much reminded of the kind of debate that was going on in the late 19th and early 20th century by those who were extremely anxious that civilization would come to an end because not everybody was in the future in universities going to study classics. Now, the fact that I'm a little less pessimistic than that. I don't think civilization's quite come to an end. But the fact that the kinds of democratic changes that made it essential for the curriculum to alter in the ways that it did then haven't necessarily been fatal for some of the forms of inquiry which those who were defending those issues in fact had at heart. And I think the same is true for us. So all the points that Homi mentioned are in different ways, I think, about adjusting to a lot of very deep and some inevitable social and economic changes in society. We are not going to be in the same position in 30 years' time as we were 30 years ago. But we shouldn't think that that's a decline, necessarily. In all kinds of ways, the disciplines that we each here represent and talking about will be as reconfigured during those years as they have been at various points in the past. But they haven't died out. And I don't think we should rush to the thought that because the current anxiety about matters like employment or contributing to economic growth are so salient, that those are entirely new. They take a different form in different generations, but they're not entirely new.
Lynn?
Well, you know, as I said, I think, you know, I basically agree with what both Stefan and Sheldon Pollock have said. We've gone through a massive transformation. There's always massive transformation going on in what the university is facing. It's not surprising that the opening up of education to so many people has raised the issue of utility, because that's, in a sense, what the rise of democratic politics was about, that utility should matter and not elite status. So this is an inevitable development, and the question is how to respond to it. And I have to confess that I'm a person of two minds. On the one hand, I think we should redo the entire structure of the university with some of the ideas that have been discussed. And on the other hand, I feel that the current structure of the university works just fine, because it turns out we can do almost anything we want within any given structure. So I'm not sure that radical change is necessarily the answer, because, so I think more to the point is my own feeling is that the only thing that's really been lacking in the humanities, if I may speak about that, is conviction about what the humanities are worth. That goes amongst the humanists themselves, and I think not amongst the students, but amongst the humanists themselves. And I think this is also a more general issue in terms of the political leadership of the nation, which is not enough conviction about what the meaning of education is. We need a lot of talk on the national level and within the university about what education is for. Yes, it has a utility, but utility can't be viewed in short-term terms. Right. And to think of it in that terms is not economically a good idea. So it's not that you have to say, forget economics, it's to say, you have the wrong understanding of the way this works, the way it works. The citing of all the people who did other things first is the point. That's not, you don't learn what you're going to do next year or 5 years from now. You learn how to be able to solve problems and gain the knowledge you need to do them, because I don't think it's one or the other. Both of those things to confront a life that's going to change constantly.
Diana?
Yes, I think just to say a few brief things, I agree with everything that's been said, that what we might want to do now is kind of convene conversations where the way we pose questions, the way we study so-called foreign cultures, I'd love to change that word, foreign, being a foreigner myself, all those approaches to some of our most intractable problems require a certain humility of studying, as was said by Professor Pollock, learning other languages. The kind of patience and engagement and rigor that goes into that produces a totally different conversation when it comes to dealing with misunderstandings. So I'm very happy to come to the table with all the instruments and the practical results of the humanities, provided we can do so with our own disciplinary rigor and strength. So, because I think we're good for a lot of things.
And Larry Bacow, the important issue you raised, about inquiry-based research having a bad time, the solution you proposed is that the way we do research should be more collaborative. But what about collaborative inquiry-based research? Is that going to change? I mean, inquiry-based research is what the university is, at one level, fundamentally about.
So I think as a society, we've shortened our time horizon for evaluating any prospective policy intervention across the board. This is true when we take a look at investments of all sorts of things, but it's also true as people take a look at investments in themselves. I read a study recently in which a group of corporate CEOs were asked, what do you look for when you hire people? Very interesting. The answer which they gave, I think all of us would subscribe to. They want critical thinkers. They want people who understand have a basic understanding of culture, people who can work in diverse environments, people who appreciate the larger world that we live in, okay? Pretty much what I think we would all say is the value of a liberal education. Then within exactly the same companies, they asked the people who were doing the entry-level hiring what they were looking for. And of course, complete mismatch in terms of the sets of skills and experiences. They wanted people who knew accounting. They wanted people who had hard skills and the like. And I think therein lies the challenge, right? And it's very, very difficult to say to a student or their parent that they should be unresponsive to that, especially given the breathtaking cost of an education. And somehow we have to find a way to get past that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, everybody says that the humanities requires long and patient discussion. And this is, in fact, where we find ourselves after 2 hours of your assembling here. And we will continue to take as much time as we need to take. But let me have some questions, please. Yes. Will you introduce yourself? Can we have a... Please introduce yourselves when you ask your questions.
Jeffrey Hamburger. I'm in the Department of History, Art, and Architecture here at Harvard. The wonderful conversation has been directed towards the future, but I'd like to look back into the past, and I'm not even talking necessarily about the remote past, which I study, but the fairly recent past. We've spoken about the humanities situated in the world vis-a-vis economics, vis-a-vis political, cultural developments of all kinds. But I was wondering if the panel could reflect a little bit about the ways in which we humanists have changed our own practice in ways that possibly have undermined our standing with certain constituencies. I'm certainly not speaking up against any form of critical practice or inquiry, because of course I fervently believe in that. But if you think about how the study of history has been drastically foreshortened in our society, if we think about the reduction in language requirements, if we think about the paradox of, on the one hand, cultivating multiculturalism and yet robbing our students of the tools that are required to really pursue that in what I would consider to be meaningful ways. And then not least, if we think about the necessary revolution that took place in our practice beginning in around 1980, and there was some reference to this in the discussion, but that tended, if one could generalize, to think of culture in some ways as a conspiracy that we now interrogate. We often use that word. We interrogate this and we interrogate that. I think we might recall that many of our students who take an interest in the humanities do so perhaps naively, but for reasons that, for lack of a better word, are better than that. And so I guess the larger question I'm asking is, rather than thinking that the world is conspiring against us as humanists, what are we as humanists doing that we might, in the spirit of humanistic practice, want to reflect on and do differently?
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple of questions. Yes, one here too. Let me take 2 or 3 questions and then we can come back.
Peter Burgard from the German department at Harvard. Thank you all. It was interesting, enlightening in parts. I was curious that only one of you mentioned MOOCs, Professor Pollock, unless I missed it while I was feeding my meter just now. And I wonder how we reconcile the humanities and the future of the university if the future of the university, the future of this university, is buying wholesale into, or retail, one might say, into MOOCs, which strike me and strike many I know in the humanities as inimical to the humanities, to education in the humanities, to higher education being the lowest form of higher education, the canned lecture. And the notwithstanding the fact that a course long known at Harvard as Heroes for Zeros is now going to be Heroes for many more zeros in short order, but the experience of the classroom, the experience of intense interaction between professor and students, breathing the same air, right, feeling the same heat, the same cold, interacting with one another, telling one another how they're bored or they don't understand one another, these sort of things. Yeah, I'm getting there. In fact, I think I was already there.
You were there.
Basically, how does one see a future for the humanities at the university and at this university specifically if what we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars into instead of professors to teach those small classes is into massive open online courses?
Thank you very much. Can I take a third question, please, from someone? Is there a third question? Yes, here. And then we'll get back to the panel.
Catherine McKenna, Department of Celtic Languages and Literatures here at Harvard. And I would say, Professor Pollock, I agree with you completely, but it doesn't, not only non-Western. I'd like to raise the question of collaboration a little more fully, which came up in several speakers and most recently with President Bacow. I think, as Deanna said, this year and a half of work among people working on the humanities project, that intense collaboration, intense focused discussion among colleagues has been amazingly rewarding. But I don't know how it translates into actual research in a discipline or an interdisciplinary context without becoming that kind of meaningless or possibly meaningless product that Stefan Collini was talking about at the beginning. It seems to me when I look at my British colleagues, they live in terror of the REF. They're totally driven by the REF. They create these big collaborative projects that turn out product, and a lot of that product is useful to many of us in our subsequent research, but I don't see how it creates any kind of different culture for the humanities to draw people into it. I don't see how it affects students to have people's teaching time being bought off so they can participate in these projects while part-timers are doing the teaching.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you very much. Are we giving, should we be more critical about what we are doing as humanists? What about spooks and MOOCs? And then collaborations. Is that the way to go? And what do we get out of it? Now, there are forced collaborations which actually don't have the impact that they should. Three important questions. Let's start with you.
Well, I think they're related. So while I said before that I'm sort of up in the air about whether everything should be changed or everything should be stay the same, I think, in fact, there are all kinds of initiatives going on, and one should not be afraid of these things. I think, again, I think it's important not to be just MOOCs are a terrible idea. In fact, what's being shown, this is in the New York Times today, is that the best way that these new things, that these massive online courses work is if it's in what they call a blended environment in which you have intensive small group discussion with real people. And I don't think we should be necessarily wedded to the idea that the lecture invented in the 12th century is the best way to convey knowledge. The lecture in a big lecture hall. I teach classes to 250 students. I have done many of these. to a certain extent, am a believer of them in person, but I am actually recording an online course, not a MOOC, but an online course that will have TAs and exams and all those other good things. And I think there is something to be said for thinking about new forms of education and how we might develop them without doing them all at once, and while paying in particular attention to the possibility for a kind of emerging hierarchy. This is not going to be bad for Harvard. It's not going to be bad for MIT. It's not going to be bad for Stanford. It's not going to be bad for UCLA, because we're going to give the courses. It's a really big issue about the rest of the educational world. I think the same thing, I would not say collaboration so much. I'm in sympathy with the idea, but I think the idea that departments become silos without enough interaction with other people is an important one. The future, it's interesting that the questions come from German and Celtic languages, because these are two of the programs that are in the most danger of disappearing in most universities for the lack of majors per faculty member. So we need to think about new things to keep, because it's not just knowledge, it's also preserving what has been known in the past and what has been written in the past and what has been thought in the past for the future. We don't just have the new knowledge, it's also preserving things for the future. And I think there are going to be a lot of new ways that we will be able to preserve things that would otherwise be in danger of disappearing from the university because of their lack of immediate utility value.
Larry?
I think all of us have an interest in seeing that we try and bend the cost curve in higher education. And that's not restricted to any discipline. And I think that everybody has an interest in seeing that we try and make higher education less expensive. And if we can use technology to do it, I think we ought to be open to it. Because what we know is that the current way in which we're doing things, which is we've been doing it for thousands of years, is pricing us out of the market. And by that I mean pricing us beyond the capacity of society to continue to invest and support the way in which we've traditionally done things. So either we can let the rest of the world impose solutions upon us, or we can take some responsibility ourselves for trying to creatively look for ways to develop those solutions ourselves. So are MOOCs the answer? I don't know. It's way too early to tell. But we ought to be willing to experiment in a whole variety of ways. I also think that in a world in which society is asking more of us, our ability to say, you know, we are making education accessible to those who otherwise would not have any option to get it is also good for us and helps to generate support for the enterprise. And believe me, we need all the friends we can get right now in Congress and elsewhere.
You know, we tend to talk as if, as you said a moment ago, or both of you, should we continue lecturing as we have since the 12th century? Or you said, as we've traditionally done things. Those kind of long historical words don't reflect the fact that education has been changing continuously. Certainly in the last 20 years, there have been major changes too. So it's not as if we're at this point confronted by the largest change ever. I mean, there have been other important incremental changes all along the way, which have rewritten the history of the university. Diana, I know one.
Just a brief comment about Catherine's question. I do think that collaboration and collective work have to be done with a very discerning sense of how and where it works. I think, for example, that our departmental silos do not really respond to the way the disciplines function, and many of us have the most exciting conversations when we cross those boundaries. I'm a great believer in the fact that area studies have done some good things, but now it's time to move beyond them and think about ways of energizing all those silos. But the undergraduate environment is one where some of that can be done without losing the seriousness of the work.
Very quick thought on the a couple of these questions. In India, I would say 10 million students a year learn Sanskrit. It's part of a language requirement. And I think of the 10 million that learn Sanskrit, 10 million do not learn Sanskrit. The education, the Sanskrit education in India is horrific at the high school level. I thought, why not, and I've been thinking about doing a massive online course. But it's precisely for the kind of reasons raised here that it's crucial to ensure that the people who are on the receiving end are part of are participants in the whole process. Just one more thought on the first question. There's no doubt that we had a serious theory orgy for a few decades there. I think that was purgative and important. But remember, part of that theory orgy was Gramsci, and Gramsci was one of the great philologists of the 20th century. And it's important to point out that Gramsci, in a way, is the theorist of conservative education for radical change. And there's a way in which that theory work was important and remains valuable.
And I have learned today that orgies are purgatives, but yes.
Just 2 points. First of all, on the question about collaboration and themes, I think one of the downsides, not sufficiently emphasized, is intellectual creativity is by and large a bottom-up activity. Themes and initiatives and tied funding are on the whole arranged from outside that world of intellectual creativity. And I think one of the consequences that we see more and more is that things that are taken away from the activities of the individual scholars and their disciplinary base become framed by other considerations. The so-called initiatives are very often something which are run by people who are not mainly in that intellectual area, and certainly where so much external funding is bespoke for particular themes, particular problems, and so on, that then, I think, makes it much more of an administrative enterprise than the kind of scholarly work that people are really worth doing, and where the collaboration will grow more spontaneously. And just a very quick comment on the first question there. Personally, I don't think that the intellectual changes in many of the disciplines we're familiar with in the last 3 or 4 decades have been damaging to us. They seem to me, on the contrary, really to have been very good adjustments to having a much more plural and democratic society and questioning a lot of our previous starting points. Surely one of the things, though, that has happened along the way there is that there has been a much wider decline of social and cultural deference, and so none of those former starting points can be taken for granted in the way that they were before. I don't think it's that we've, as it were, abandoned that. We have to respond to that. The one change that I would just quickly say that we might think of internally as being needed in terms of perception is there is a strong sense that the rewards and structure of professional academic careers now too much take people away from the classroom and too much take scholars out of running their own universities. By and large, the forms of professional reward have been so concentrated on research that it becomes a great achievement for somebody to get a very big grant, which takes them out of teaching, and it's become less and less common, as we all know, for senior scholars to take a hand in running their bit of the institution. These, I think, are problems of, as it were, public relations, as well as problems that are damaging internally to our community. And maybe those are some of the things that we do need to rethink.
Now, I'm going to take another 3 questions, but I want to ask my panelists to do something for me. When we finish the question in the next 10 minutes, I will ask President Faust to say something. But before that, I want to set a test for you. Imagine that we have a campaign. Imagine that there is a funding campaign.
Imagine.
I want each of you to give me one idea of what the campaign should ask for in the humanities. Just imagine that there is a campaign. I'm not saying there is one. Just imagine this. It's a kind of hypothetical. So please, if you could all think of your ask, I'd be very grateful. Yes.
James Simpson, English Department. I'm directing my comments at the lucid and refreshing paper of Lynn Hunt. As chair of the English Department, I'm obliged to do 2 things. One is to dispel a misconception in your paper, and the other is to say how happy I am that you have promoted that misconception. Let me dispel it first. The new courses to which you point did indeed replace explicitly canonical courses. These new courses, in fact, contain lots of canonical material, but they have been rebranded and redriven, if you like, by the theme of cultural mobility. So, in fact, those courses do have a lot of great books, or books that we consider great. But why am I delighted? Precisely in the light of the information you've given in your paper, that you have transmitted this misconception. You have said to us that in order to gain much greater diversity amongst the undergraduate concentrators of a given department, we have to move away from lower the profile of the canon. So I would love, in the light of your paper, people to go away from this event saying that be an English concentrator. There you can read the great books without ever needing to know that they were the canon. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Raji Mangalam, and I might be the
Thank you so
I
much.
might be the enemy in your camp because I am a scientist by brand, and I do agree with what Professor Emeritus of Tufts pointed out. I think, for me, my biased definition of a humanist is one who transcends a discipline. I just think that a scientist is a humanist, and a humanist is a scientist. And I'm a little bit disturbed by what I see as being territorial among scientists, being the same thing, being a little bit, is my understanding is that I see a little bit of that territorialism being played out here as well. And I just think humanists are everywhere, and that's what you're trying to create and send these people out into society. And those are the people with an insatiable appetite for the world and all of its contents, and period. There's nothing different between people. So do you perceive that? I think we'd be all better off if we really didn't spend all that much time seeing the distinctions between those various disciplines as opposed to what's common between the best of best among all disciplines. It's the very bottom is the same, be it between disciplines or between countries. And I feel there's a little bit of territorialism that I sense, not just here, everywhere. And I think that somehow, that's my question is, do you feel like you talk a lot about humanists as being somewhat separate from them being everywhere?
Who wants to take this on?
No, I ask one more question. You're going to have three?
Howard. Well, there's a question. No, all right. I'll come to you. I'm going to take four, actually.
Hi, Howard Gardner from the School of Education. But my question comes out of some reflection sessions that I've been running with freshmen at Harvard College. Last year, among my students, one of them said to me, I'm not interested in discussing problems for which there are no solutions. And he was actually, I thought, the most able student in the class, and the question kind of took me aback. So in thinking about the session today, Larry Bacow spoke most explicitly about helping to solve problems, and that's certainly the rhetoric in the country nowadays. Nonetheless, certainly in some of the talks today, what we brought out were the problematizing aspects of the humanities. And so I guess my question is, do you think that it's inaccurate to speak about the humanities as tending toward problematizing and ruminating about problems? Or if that's correct, what is the best way to engage students on the dialectic, so to speak, between problem finding, problematizing, and when appropriate, providing solutions?
I'm going to take, yes, and then I'm going to ask that.
Sean Kelly, I'm the chair of the philosophy department here at Harvard. I also wanted to ask Professor Hunt, I really enjoyed your presentation. One of the things that it brought out was a distinction between philosophy on the one hand and a lot of of the disciplines in the humanities. For one thing, we're much less feminized than a lot of the other disciplines, though we're trying hard to bring women into our discipline. After your presentation, I'm worried that we're bringing our salaries down by trying to do that. But we continue to try to do that. We think it's important to do that. I don't know why we have fewer women in our discipline, but one of the issues that that you also brought out is that we seem to be increasing, and it's true at Harvard also, our number of concentrators when other of the disciplines in the humanities are decreasing them. Your explanation of it, though, I wasn't sure I believed it. So you said that, and this may be true at UCLA, I know the department a bit, but I don't know the concentration requirements all that well. You said that the philosophy department at UCLA tends not to deal with a canon, but instead does skill-based stuff. With the philosophy departments that I'm most familiar with, Berkeley, Stanford, Princeton, and here, that's definitely not true. We have a canon. We have Aristotle and Plato, and we have Descartes to Kant, and every undergraduate takes at least 3 courses in this. And we really recognize that that's an important aspect of our discipline. And although there are some skills that we teach logic and we teach various kinds of critical argument, we don't primarily do that. We do that in the service of pursuing a certain range of questions. So it seems to me that your explanation of the distinction maybe isn't the right one, but I agree there's a distinction, and I'd really like to know, because I don't understand what the distinction is. We haven't had the canon wars in the way that other disciplines in the humanities have. We sort of value our canon. We do have some skills, but they're not the only thing that we do, and we're increasing. I don't know why, and we're not feminizing. I don't understand why this is, and I'd love to know if people have...
Sean, since you have the mic, could you just speak for literally a second about your philosophy project in schools? I think the audience should know about it.
Well, thanks. Yeah,
Very quickly.
Very quickly, yeah. We're bringing philosophy into K-12 education, especially in the elementary school level. I have a lot of undergraduate and graduate student volunteers who help me bring a kind of inquiry-based, discussion-based community into the elementary schools. And it's very different from what normally happens in the elementary schools, and it helps the students who often aren't doing well do something very different.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thank you. So, Lynn, why don't you start, since there was a question explicitly.
You know, I mean, I brought up a lot of different, I mean, this was really, it kind of sort of came as news to me, frankly, that philosophy was doing better. And I am the last person in the world who should be talking about why philosophy is doing better, because I don't have a sense of the overall picture of it. I thought it was, I do have the sense that at our place, philosophy and classics are both doing better. English is doing okay. Philosophy and classics are actually sort of on the upswing in terms of the number of majors. Foreign languages and literatures are facing a kind of crisis situation. And I was just interested in one of the things I've always been interested in is kind of the relative balance within the humanities, where in many places history is not in the humanities, it's not at UCLA, and English is a kind of behemoth within the humanities, and there's a big issue about what the structure should be. So I think one of the answers to Homi's original question was that I think part of the campaign should be seriously thinking about what the structure of the humanities should be like in the future that we're going to live in which this issue of K through 12 is similar, it's not the same, but has certain resonance with the MOOC issue, which is what is our responsibility to a broader world since we are a democratizing university? What is our responsibility? I think that's a really big question for the future. I do think philosophy departments vary enormously, and I think actually philosophy departments have had a fair amount of dispute about the role of continental philosophy, as it's called, within their curriculum. So I'm not sure it's quite as happy as you presented it, but I think that's a very valid question. I just think this is one of the things we need to think about. Why are some fields able to kind of reconfigure in a way that at least satisfies the immediate utility question of enrollments, and others are having more trouble?
Shelley.
Very briefly, my proposal for fundraising would be global.
You're going straight to that. You're not taking up any of
No, I intend to, but through the back door. Global humanities for a global university. And the interesting part about the philosophy, the lack of canon wars in the philosophy department, is that philosophy departments decided at some point that philosophy or the analysis of thinking was a peculiarly Western phenomenon. So there are very few departments in the United States where, forget about continental philosophy, but Chinese thought, Indian thought, Arabic philosophy are never taught. Notre Dame may be one exception, Hawaii, but outside of that, the canon wars maybe should have happened in philosophy.
So your pitch would be for the campaign, funding for a global humanities for a global university.
Exactly.
And yours, Lynn, would be?
Thinking about restructuring humanities to reduce the importance of English.
To reduce the importance of English. I think that's a remarkably important contribution. It's on that platform that we will ask. What about you, Steph?
Well, first, just a quick point about a couple of these questions. I think one of the things, question over there, and these about the canon bring out that we perhaps are not making enough of, is that a lot of our education is about something. It is actually about learning about particular times and particular places, and as is our research. And we tend, I think, in our rhetoric of justification, to put the emphasis so much on skills and on some, as it were, disembodied analysis. But actually, there are very good reasons why we teach a lot of the things that we teach, and no working party, no matter how well staffed, is starting from scratch. We have very rich cultural traditions here, which we may want to adapt in various ways, but we do actually have an accumulated body of knowledge about that. That's what I would say about that aspect of those questions. On the question of the campaign, I'm going to cheat in the following way and choose something which every fundraiser will tell you is a dead duck before you've even left the table. And that is, I do think that one drawback to all such initiatives is precisely that they put the money in the new. The only way to sell something is that this is something exciting, this is an innovation, this is cross-disciplinary, transdisciplinary. One of the hardest things is going to be for universities, given especially the decline in public funding, is to maintain core activities in our central disciplines. And I think the, as it were, trick that we have to try to perform in raising money for these sorts of things is not to present that as old-fashioned or conservative or simply inert. That is probably to fuel the best side of the things that we do. But we don't have to dress it up always as something quite new or separate from our previous intellectual activities.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just wanted to go back to Howard's question briefly, and we hear a lot about a resistance to critique or to problematize. I think perhaps the notion of defamiliarizing is more productive in the sense that we make our students aware of how they ought to be very alert about the messages that they receive, and whether it is in the sphere of advertising, or how to look, how to listen, and how deeply complex all those activities are. And then about the campaign, Homi, I'm going to be a little resistant and not just pick one thing, because I constantly feel that by picking one thing, we're reducing things. So let me take a break on that.
Oh, I thought you'd give us a constellation of things. No?
You and I tried that one before. So don't make me revisit trauma.
Thank you. Larry.
The campaign question is an easy one. I would raise unrestricted funds and put them in the hands of the area dean for the humanities.
And it's filmed.
Larry, give us another one.
Oh, no, actually, here Stefan and I are in radical agreement, because I think that it's very easy for universities to actually go broke raising money, because rare is the gift that pays 100% of the marginal cost of a new activity. And if you're not careful of what you wind up doing, unless it's a real priority, the institution would have done it in the absence of the gift, you actually weaken the institution. The new gift becomes a tax on the core activities of the institution. So I'm in radical agreement with Stefan when he says, let's raise money for the core. And I think the best way to raise money for the core is, in fact, to try and raise unrestricted funds and use them in ways that empower people who have great ideas. So,
thank you very much. May I invite President Faust to give us her comments.
I will be very, very brief, because everyone has had a lot of conversation and a lot of interesting insights. I want to say a deep thanks to everyone on the panel, and also to the Humanities Project, and I'm going to come see you. I'm sorry I had to postpone my visit. This panel grew out of really very selfish, may I say, instrumental personal interest on my part, in that I'm so often in a situation where I don't want to be defensive and say defending the humanities, perhaps advancing the humanities or explaining the humanities to donors, to politicians in Washington, D.C., on an international stage where I've actually been asked on a number of occasions when I've traveled to India, to China, to speak about the humanities. There's a request from individuals who support the humanities that the president of Harvard choose that as her subject. So I find myself quite often turning to the questions that you turned to today. And so I was eager to get all the help I could from this very distinguished panel of experts in order to enhance my ability to represent what I think is such an important set of questions to a world that is here and beyond. I think there are two aspects that I just focus on. As I think about the arguments that I advance in those contexts, I think of one set of them as instrumental, and I think that goes to Stefan's comment at the beginning about you've got to think about your audience. And so I find that there are and can be pretty powerful instrumental arguments for the humanities. As I find myself in worlds where there's enormous stress on innovation, creativity, even problem solving, I find that to talk about the humanities as enabling people to think beyond their own world. How can you change things? How can you innovate? How can you be creative if you have no notion that things have been different or things are different in other places, in other times, in other languages? And so I argue for the humanities as a real foundation for the kind of creativity that we see as essential to the future in any field that anybody is going to enter. But then I do think it's important that we all try to, again, to borrow Stefan's terms, to hold our nerve, to try to make arguments that are not instrumental. Because these are arguments that join us with our colleagues in science and across the university who want to pursue questions because they are interesting. Those questions may ultimately prove to be instrumental in some way and yield outcomes that have significant, dangerous word, impact in the wider world. And yet, we must defend knowledge for its own sake. That is part of what universities are about. So how can we be sure to try to make that case? And I've been trying very hard to make that case with people in Washington and the way they talk about education more generally, which has been entirely instrumental. And many of the people making this case have been graduates of Harvard, arguing that the first year's salary out of college is the measure of the value of a college education. And that, I think, is a travesty. I'm very happy to have been forwarded today, a little message of something that our president said about funding science. It was about funding science. He talked about how it'll make the foundation for economic growth, but he said it's also because it's who we are and because civilization depends on that kind of inquiry. And I thought that was very exciting to see because those are the kinds of arguments that we need to have coming out of the voices that run our societies. And so we need to give them the language. We need to explain to them and to try to impress on them why it's so important to argue in those terms. And just let me close by saying one more thing about holding one's nerve. And it goes in a way to Howard's question about the student who said problems for which there are no solutions. What could be more interesting? Can we convince that student that perhaps the most interesting thing is to be able to critique the world you're in, to look beyond that world, to come up with the best way of posing questions? Because that ultimately is going to be the foundation for a life of learning and a life of discovery and a life of contributions to the society that we can see more clearly if we come at it with that kind of a perspective. Thank you all so much for what you've done tonight. I really appreciate it.